Thank you so much, and thank you everyone for coming inside on such a beautiful day. And it's such an honor to be a part of this, and especially to get to be in conversation with you. And this summer, your book arrived, and I was it came and it was during a heat wave in Boulder, which from reading your book is not too much to cry about, but it was in the upper 90s for almost 2 weeks, and we had wildfires both close and distance, and I wasn't ready to kind of crack it open because I was feeling my own boil. And then when I started reading it, I was just amazed. The depth that you go within each chapter. I would read a chapter each evening, and I learned so much. And working in environmental studies for a long period of time, sometimes you might, oh, I already know about these dynamics. And every chapter I learned something amazing, and it was the way that you touch people, stories, and also the stories of place was phenomenal. And I told you from reading the text and also the adventures that you brought in there and the literacy of so many places, I've, in my mind, termed you the Anthony Bourdain of climate change, but in a really good way. And I know you've written so many books around climate change, and you're also a recurring author for Rolling Stone on the climate change beat. And I would just really be interested in starting off and hearing what initially sparked your passion for climate change issues, and particularly how you so skillfully collect these stories and put them into your writing.
Well, thank you very much. The Anthony Bourdain line is something my publisher would love. And it's so great to be here at JLF again. I've seen a lot of familiar faces. I was in Jaipur earlier this year. That was wonderful. This is my second time here in Boulder. Very happy to be back. So did you ask me what sparked this book or my climate change?
Both, but in particular, how you got just passionate about climate change.
So that's interesting because it was sort of a surprise to me too. I grew up in California. I did not grow up in a kind of environmentally conscious family. You know, we did hiking and stuff, but I also was a deer hunter and a pheasant hunter, and my father and grandparents were all kind of outdoorsy in that sort of way. I went to work when I was 19 for this little company that had this ridiculous name with a little rainbow logo called Apple. It was in a dentist's office at the time, and there was this guy named Steve Jobs running around barefoot. And I worked there for about a year and a half and thought this was the stupidest thing ever. This company is going nowhere. They don't know anything about what they're doing. I want to go somewhere where there's something interesting happening in the world. So I brilliantly dropped out, left Apple, and went to Lake Tahoe and dealt blackjack on the graveyard shift and skied during the day. And that was, but that was sort of an interesting moment for me because I spent a lot of time outdoors and hiking around and reading Joseph Conrad and things. And that was the first idea about kind of being a writer. But then I went to Berkeley and fell into journalism as I had imagined being a novelist, and fell into journalism because I was a very bad novelist and I liked asking people questions. So long story, I got a job in New York covering crime in New York City, and spent a couple of years doing that. And my entry into writing about climate change came, I remember exactly the moment it came. It was in 2001, just after George W. Bush had taken office. And the New York Times called me up and said, this was the time, I don't know if any of you remember, this thing called the Bush-Cheney Energy Plan. And there was going to be, the sort of big resurgence of fossil fuels. And the editor for the New York Times called me up and said, we'd like you to go to West Virginia and write about the comeback of the coal industry. We think it's going to be an important story. And I paused for a moment, and had this little thought bubble above my head, like, coal, what are you talking about? There's no coal in America. That's something that happens in Charles Dickens novels. I knew nothing about it. I'd never seen coal. But of course, to my editor, I said, that's a great idea. And I went to West Virginia and spent a month in West Virginia reporting on the coal industry. And that was, Al Gore once said to me that everybody who cares about climate change has an oh shit moment. And that was my oh shit moment. Seeing the coal mining in West Virginia, seeing the blasting of the mountaintops to remove the coal, seeing the environmental devastation, and then thinking about what happens to when you burn coal. And that was my sort of awakening to climate change, because prior to that, I had kind of imagined that energy just flowed down from some golden bowl in the sky. I had no idea where it came from. And that, literally that moment, which was in 2001, that turned into a cover story for the New York Times Magazine, which then turned into a book. I've basically not written about anything else. So that was 23 years ago. It occurred to me right then, just in a sheer journalistic way, that climate change is the great story of our time. That how we're going to generate energy, how we're going to shift away from fossil fuels, the consequences of burning fossil fuels, is this epic, epic story of human civilization. And I've been fascinated with it ever since. I'm as fascinated with it today, 23 years later, as I was that day. So that's my origin story.
Thank you. Yeah. Well, another question pops out of that. Well, there were a few moments reading your book that I had a little bit of a cry. And there was one with I don't know if it was a starfish or there was some sea organism that is melting because the waters are getting so hot. And I wonder if your own process of really becoming a environmental climate change journalist, but I would assume kind of an environmentalist, if you had your own process of a little bit of heartbreak for the world?
Yeah. I mean, of course, you can't think about climate change, you can't think about all of this without having a profound sense of loss and sorrow. But it's not only that, right? I mean, part of the reason people always ask me, you've been writing about climate change for 23 years, why aren't you not living in your basement, drinking whiskey and scrawling on the wall with crayons about the lost world for your children? And it's because as much as there is this encounter with loss, which I see all the time and is a big part of what I write about, there's also this encounter with inspiration and people thinking differently and determined to save the world. And so in certain ways, I find what I write about incredibly inspiring, because I meet people like you who come to talks like this and are concerned and want to learn more and have intelligent questions and care about the world. I meet entrepreneurs who are doing amazing things, developing new energy projects. I meet political activists who are working incredibly hard trying to organize the climate movement. I meet architects who are thinking about how to build buildings in different ways. I mean, all of this. And to me, it's incredibly inspiring. And one of the things about this, the other thing about this beat that really I feel very powerfully, is that it's made my seeing of the world more vivid. When I walk on Miami Beach, I pay a lot of attention because I know Miami Beach is not going to be there very long. I mean, Miami Beach is a very temporary arrangement of sand, historically in a geologic sense, but also in a real human sense. I feel that way when I go hiking in the Rockies. I feel that way when I go to Antarctica and see the glaciers. Writing about this has, in a way, made my life more vivid.
Well, let's turn to the origin story of this book. And I know from reading it that it was, I'm assuming, I know it was inspired in part by your partner, Simone, who told you to write it. And then
Whatever she
also,
says, yes.
right,
Yeah.
right, very good. And also that you were transplanted from New York to Texas because of love, but it turned you into a Texan living in the heat and being around the West. So I wonder if you could tell us more about that.
Well, the book actually had its genesis in Phoenix. Most books kind of, my other books, arise out of this sort of stew of, imagination and thinking and struggle and everything. This book was, I can pinpoint exactly when it was born. I was in Phoenix in the summer of 2017. It was a hot day. I had a meeting downtown. I called an Uber. The Uber didn't show up. I was worried about being late for the meeting, so I decided to basically run 15 blocks in downtown Phoenix on a very hot day. Not a smart thing to do. And by the time I got those 15 blocks, my heart was pounding. I was dizzy. I thought I was gonna pass out. And I thought, oh my gosh, this heat is really dangerous, which sounds like a very banal thing to say, which it kind of is, of course. But it's especially banal for a guy who's been covering climate change at that time for more than 15 years. Like, duh, what have you been writing about for 15 years? But it was emblematic to me of the way we intellectualize this problem of climate change. Even though I had been writing about it for a long time, I've been all over the world. I'd seen melting glaciers and dying trees and forest fires and floods, all that stuff. It had never occurred to me that I could die on a hot day by doing something stupid. And that was the moment when I thought, oh, maybe there's something to write about here, because if I don't understand this, there's probably a lot of other people who don't understand this too. And then I had a call with a friend of mine that night. I was explaining to him what had happened, and I realized that I didn't even know what heat was. I knew what a thermometer was, I knew what temperature was, but if you asked me what is heat, I couldn't have told you. And so I thought, oh, okay, there's my next book. It was literally like that day.
Great, great, yeah. Gosh, I have so many questions now that keep coming up. But maybe one of the stories that I was, and so many of the stories I was just absolutely touched by, but there was one that you talk about a migrant worker who is basically killed at work. And I spent a lot of time in Arizona, and you write so much about the trend in so many places of air conditioning and all sorts of how people, protect themselves from the heat, false protection. And I was struck in how well throughout your book you covered justice and gender and class, and environmental justice is something that I'm really passionate by, and I often, find myself in conversations with, someone who presents as a kind of cis white male, and I was actually like, wow, Jeff, you did such a good job on really diving into issues of social and environmental and all of these various camps, and I wonder, is that latent throughout all your work, and how maybe the research and stories in this book maybe set the tone even stronger for that?
I mean, I certainly hope it's, throughout my work, I'm certainly sensitive to thinking about that. But it's particularly powerful here, I think, because, in the book I call heat a predatory force. And it really is. It goes after the most vulnerable people first, right? People who don't have money, access to air conditioning, people who are working outside, don't have the luxury of working at a desk in a nice office, people who are older, have health issues, people, young children who have not yet developed sweat glands, all that kind of thing. So by definition, writing about heat is about writing about justice and vulnerability. And I really worked hard to make that the center of these stories in this book, because if you don't understand that, then you really don't understand this question of heat, and you don't understand why I'm writing a book about it, and you don't understand why it's a risk. And you just go into the thing of, well, who cares about heat? Just get air conditioning. What's the problem? I understand why you're worried about it. Just buy air conditioning for people. It's no big deal. And it's so much more complicated than that, right?
Yeah, and you paint a really, this summer when I was experiencing heat and reading your book, it reaffirmed for me never to get air conditioning, or to be thankful that I live somewhere where the heat goes away at a certain point. And I guess, could you speak a little bit about some of the global places where you witnessed and wrote about some of the temperatures that I can't even fathom, and what's going on?
Yeah, so I mean, one of the things that's, when we talk about climate change, we talk about average temperatures. Probably everyone in this room who's here understands all of this pretty well and knows about these temperature targets of 1.5 C of warming or 2 C of warming and all that. But, that's just talking about global averages masks the, more and more extreme heat waves that are happening in hotter and hotter, in places that are hotter and hotter. So, I mean, one example of this in the U.S. was the heat wave in 2021 in the Pacific Northwest, where you had temperatures of like 120 degrees in Portland, of all places. I mean, it was like snow in the Sahara. It was so unusual. And in the book, I write about places like India, Pakistan, Africa, where you have these that have always, like Texas, where I live also, have always been hot places. But as our global averages heat up, these places are getting more and more extreme heat waves. And in the book, I talk about this idea of Goldilocks zone, that every living thing, whether it's you and me, or it's a mosquito, or a redwood tree, or a grizzly bear, they all have a certain zone that they can thrive in, right? That, they have to live in to maintain their sort of body temperature. It's a thing for every living creature. And if you get out of that Goldilocks zone, you have to either migrate to a cooler place. So there's lots of studies about, fish moving to different places, frogs moving higher up the mountains to cooler places. The history of human evolution has to do with following the climate as it's changed. We've developed technology to adapt with, air conditioning and building and structures like that. But the basic rule is, if you get out of your Goldilocks zone, then you die. If you can't move to a cooler place, you die. And that's a universal truth for all living things. And what's happening in some places in the world that I write about, Pakistan particularly comes to mind, and India also, there are other places, but those are the places I kind of focus on, where we're getting to the edge of this Goldilocks zone. We're getting to a place where survival of a human being in these kinds of conditions, people who don't have access to air conditioning, which in many of these places is the vast majority, their very survival is in danger. That we're getting outside of that limit of temperatures that humans can survive in. And so that's one of the sort of, people always ask, when is it going to be too hot for humans to survive in this parts of Pakistan, or particular parts of India, or particular parts of Texas for that matter? That's a complicated question, because it depends on your personal health and all that kind of thing, and your access to money and shelter and all that kind of thing. But there are limits, right? There are physical limits that our body cannot handle.
Thank you. And I just to mention, because we have time. And also there's the naming of your book is so good in terms of bringing up for maybe someone who just sees it on the shelf that, oh, this is a danger for me, this extreme heat. And so many of us have stories or read the news, see Europe and all different places globally and locally. But your book also gets so deeply into how heat works in the warming of the planet, and how not only are so many different species migrating, non-human species migrating to places where they may be causing harm or they're being harmed, but also really talking about some of these epidemics with insects and pathogens. And I wonder if you could, not to freak everyone out, but but speak a little bit about that, because I think, and I can be very U.S. centric, and my stereotype of someone in the U.S., oh, climate change, someone's working on that, or it's maybe not everyone in this room, but in really looking at how detrimental it is for all sentient beings and what's actually happening, especially including the human, but also beyond human. Could you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, every living thing has a Goldilocks zone, and what they do, what every creature does when the temperatures are changing fast is move. And if they can't move, they're in big trouble. So coral reefs are living things, but they're not really very nimble. A coral reef can't just like pick up and run along on its little feet to cooler waters, right? So that's why coral reefs are so vulnerable to changes in ocean temperatures. The redwood forests in California, where I grew up, they're very vulnerable to temperature change, and they will, if the temperature changed slowly enough, they could migrate with those temperature changes. We're seeing migration of forests here, in here up and north into Canada. The problem is the speed of these changes, right? And so certain creatures and certain living things can move and adapt as these temperatures rise, and some can't. And the emblematic creature that can move very well and is very adaptable is, for example, mosquitoes. They obviously fly, they can move wherever they want to go, and as temperatures change, mosquitoes move with these temperature changes. And the problem with that, as most of you know, is that mosquitoes carry things that we humans are not happy to have around, like the pathogens that cause Zika, or dengue fever, or malaria. So as these mosquitoes are moving to new regions, this has tremendous human implications. The changes in malaria patterns in Africa right now, are making, hundreds of thousands of people more vulnerable in new places. Less vulnerable in some places because the mosquitoes are leaving certain places and going to other places. Changing the dynamics in places like Mexico City, where my wife is from, and I've spent a lot of time. They never had any problems with mosquitoes ever before. There's no screens in Mexico City. It's had this sort of perfect, cool climate, not suitable for mosquitoes. Well, now all of a sudden it's warming up, and mosquitoes are arriving, and along with it is Zika and dengue, right? And we've seen the first resurgence of malaria in the U.S. in decades. So these disease changes are one of these changes in migration patterns of animals is one of the sort of second order effects of a warming world that we don't think about in the simple discussion about what it does to our bodies and heat strokes and things like that, which are all really important. And I make the argument, well, I quote scientists who make the argument in the book that, if there's, well, not if, when there's another pandemic, the chances are good it will be driven by migrating animals who are changing where they live because of these temperature changes. And they will have what one of the scientists in my book calls a meet cute, which is a phrase in Hollywood romantic comedies where, two people are in the grocery store and they go around a corner and they bump into each other and they spill the milk and they bend down to pick up the milk together and they fall in love, and that's the story, right? Well, there's meet cutes in the animal world too. And sometimes when you have these meet cutes, you have these animals that are moving around. And, oh, this mosquito meets, or this bat meets this deer, and they exchange blood, and they have a exchange of fluids in some way. Well, these pathogens are jumping around also, and there's a lot of concern that kind of jump of pathogens or viruses from one animal to another as a result of these migrations is what is going to spark the next pandemic.
Thank you. Well, let's see. My main areas of teaching are ecopsychology and transformative studies, transformative learning. And so reading your book, I'm always thinking about, well, how are we going to put this into action, or well, how's this changing world? And it was so well presented, and there's something with working around people in terms of getting them awake and aware about climate change that a lot of folks, it's hard to talk to our loved ones or our students or our neighbors about these issues, because often folks want to have the full story with all the facts and statistics from a very linear approach from A to B to Z. And your book was actually one of those books that I just want to well, just read this. You'll know what the problems are. And then I also, in my mind, thought a lot about, it has a lot of information, also a lot of heartfelt stories and unpacking patterns. And I also wondered, in terms of your writing it, who was your target audience, and what do you want folks to take away from reading it?
That's an interesting question. And my target audience is basically anybody who's in this room. People who are curious enough about this to who understand that climate change is a real thing, who understand the basics of it, but sort of like me on that day in Phoenix, don't really grasp the sort of more complex dimensions of it. Sometimes people say to me, well, what do you say to people, when you encounter climate deniers and they say climate change isn't real, or temperature, the Earth's climate has always changed? And I'm like, I don't really have anything to say to them, because nothing I'm going to say in 5 minutes or 10 minutes is going to change any of those people's minds. Whatever. That's not my audience. My audience is people who like to read, who care about human beings and the world and life around them, and know that I don't want to have to explain in my writing or in my books that CO2 creates this, traps warmth, and we know this because it can go through the whole craziness. Not craziness. It's not crazy at all. But the whole the story that's been told 10 bazillion times, that this is real. The science is as solid as the science of gravity. There's no. I don't want to talk about that. What I want to talk about is the complex and subtle implications of these changes that we're seeing and the warming that we're seeing, and help people understand how it's going to affect their lives. I think of the book not as some kind of doomer thing, but as a sort of survival guide. I think all of us who are alive in 2024 and have, kids, but also just us, need to think about this, whether it's for your own health, for your own financial well-being, for a lot of reasons. And so I think my audience is the person I have in my mind. Well, it's basically my wife, but she's my ideal reader. I'm lucky enough to be married to someone who, until she met me, really didn't care about climate change at all, but is an intelligent, curious person, and she knows nothing about science. So anytime I do anything too sciencey at all, she's immediately like a red pencil through it all, right? That's who I have in mind. I want to activate people and help educate and people and entertain, frankly, people who are curious about this. I'm not interested in convincing people that the Earth is not flat, right? That's not my audience.
Thank you. And actually, you just brought up entertain, and that is actually another dimension of your book that I really enjoyed. And when we were talking with our mics off before, I was mentioning it. Jeff, throughout this book, goes on some really wild adventures, which many of us would not want to. Many people, especially if we were Boulder, you'd be like, yeah. But some were quite treacherous and dangerous, and some sounded pretty fun in some ways too. So, could you talk about maybe your kind of explorer, kind of risk journalism, and also maybe some of the enjoyment that might come from that? Not to put words in your mouth.
Yeah, no, I mean, first of all, I think that I'm really interested in storytelling. I think that's how we communicate, is telling stories. And I think of this book as, 12 stories. It's like, I don't know if any of you know the famous Wallace Stevens poem, 13 Ways of Looking at a Blackbird. Well, I think of this as 13 ways of looking at heat. And it's sort of looking at this from all these different perspectives and kind of deliberately telling stories about it. I think, a lot of the writing about climate is, all this is data driven, and I'm bored with all that. I want to tell stories. And I also feel like it, my style of doing that is to go out into the world. I am a person who does not really do my reporting from behind the desk, but goes out into the world and talks to people. And that's always been what I've enjoyed, what I'm good at, whether it's writing about homicides in New York City, writing about, or writing about climate change. And so the book has a lot of, I went to Antarctica for 6 weeks on a ship, wild adventure on this ship to look at the West Antarctic ice sheet and the implications of small temperature changes in the Southern Ocean and what that means. I went to India and spent a couple of weeks with a teacher and just followed her through her day and how she coped with heat. I went on a 6-week cross-country ski trip on Baffin Island, which is in the northeast territory of Canada, right across from Greenland, a place with the highest density of polar bears in the world. And we did a 6-week cross-country ski trip where we camped every night on the ice and basically laid out like hot dogs for the polar bears. We would wake up in the morning and see, polar bear tracks, twice the size of my hand within 10 feet of our tent, I learned a very important thing on that trip, which was that in the competition at night between fear and fatigue, when you got into my tent and I'm so tired, but I'm really afraid a polar bear is going to eat me, I was like, okay, fuck it, I'm going to sleep. There was just no way I was going to stay up every night and be terrified of the polar bear. I just went to sleep. Fatigue wins every time. But I did have a very dramatic encounter with a polar bear, which I will not tell you the full details about, but you can read it in the book. But I was basically face to face with a bear in a very unexpected and surprising way. So I like that. I just like that. That's just kind of, I'm a person who likes to go out into the world, whether it's talking to you here or, in the streets of the slums of Lagos, Nigeria, which I spent a lot of time in for my previous book, or whether it's on Baffin Island with the polar bears. I like that. And those are the kind of stories that I like. And so I tell the kinds of stories that I like to hear, right? And so it's just like who I am.
Well, I'm really grateful for who you are. I know we both were at, and now I'm slipping, the author that spoke this morning, Kiko
Ayer.
Kiko Ayer. And I think he said something about he's home 95% of the time and a Taurus 5% of the time. When I was reading your book, I was thinking you're out there like 65% of the time. Could you say, I'm just curious, in terms of your data gathering, story gathering, place gathering, and writing, what's your kind of pattern there?
Yeah, I mean, it's very, instinctive, and I don't have I don't have it like planned out. A lot of things come up when you're working on a book like this that I hadn't. Well, first of all, the thing that came up most obviously when I was working on this book was COVID. And I started the book with one plan, and then all of a sudden COVID happened, and I had to rethink everything. And so there's a lot of improvisation when you're putting together a book. You can have a plan for where you want to go and what you'd like to report and what you'd like to write about, and then things happen. COVID happens, or you meet somebody who's more interesting, or you're on a phone call and someone says, like my trip to Baffin Island with the polar bears, I was on a phone call with a scientist, and we were talking about something nothing to do with Baffin Island, and he mentioned he's taking a trip to Baffin Island and doing this cross-country, 400-mile cross-country ski trip on Baffin. And I said, oh man, that sounds fantastic, what a fun thing. And he said, oh, you want to go? And I'm like, what? And he said, well, the other guy that I was going with dropped out the other day, and we need one more, there were 3 of them, and they need one more person, do you want to go? And I was like, well, let me think about this for a minute, but kind of, yeah. But it wasn't planned, right? I mean, it comes up. And so part of putting a book together, for me, what makes it so sort of terrifying, there are many things that make it terrifying, but one of the things is that you are constantly reacting to stuff. And so there'll be big holes in the book of things I want to talk about, and I won't know how to do it. And for example, there's a chapter about air conditioning in the book, and the history of air conditioning. And I was kind of at a loss about how am I going to tell the history of air conditioning, and sounds so boring, and how am I going to make this interesting, because air conditioning is a really important part of this book. And then I happened to be having dinner with a friend of my wife's, and she said, oh, my father started the first air conditioning company in Texas. And he became, like, in 10 years, like a billionaire. And I'm like, wow, really? What's his name? And she told me, and I looked into him, and he was a fascinating guy. And so the whole chapter is built around this one guy who I'd never even heard of, and nobody else had basically heard of either. Nothing had been written about him. It just came out of a conversation at a dinner, and like you have to think, oh, that sounds like an interesting story. Let me check it out. And sometimes you hear that and you check it out, and it's like, that's not so interesting, But sometimes you hear things like that, and you explore it further, and you think, oh my gosh, that's so fascinating. And so my entire chapter is built around something that just came out of a conversation at a casual dinner.
Yeah, and if I recall, that's the chapter where we learn about just ice in general, like, because you created like ice blocks and companies that did that.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's one thing I just loved about the book is to read a whole book on climate. Oh, it's going to be so scary, but you have such a graceful way of each chapter, and I love the way that you're framing it with the 12 or 13 kind of stories, lenses, where you introduce something, but then you get into these really fascinating dimensions. Some chapters, it felt like you were like Bill Nye, the science guy, and then some were more historical or anthropological. And so I mean, I really learned so much. And one of my favorite chapters, this was the chapter that actually got me most inspired, was, I forget the title of it, but it was the one that really talked about cities and greening of the cities and sustainability. And I don't know if you meant to, but in a lot of ways it created this kind of inspiring vision of what cities can be. And I live in Boulder, which is a very green, it's a city, but I'm like, it's not really a city. But I wonder if you want to say something about that, and then we'll get into questions from the audience.
Yeah, I mean, that chapter was important to me because I really, this is not any kind of a doomer book, as I said. I think that, there's going to be a lot of changes, but for better and for worse. And one of the things I'm trying to do is inspire changes for the better. And I became fascinated with Paris, with what Paris is doing. Everyone knows about Paris now because of the Olympics, but they're an example of a iconic city that everyone is familiar with. I mean, maybe you haven't been there, but everyone has a vision of Paris in their head. And, because of strong political leadership from the mayor there and other reasons, it's really transforming itself for the 21st century. They're doing amazing things there, from restricting vehicles in the inner city to, reimagining the Champs-Élysées to make it more green, putting in a lot of trees, narrowing it, reimagining the Place de la Concorde, creating all this green space in the city itself, cleaning up the Seine so that you can swim in it. Many people I think know the stories. This summer they were back and forth about whether they could do the swim in the Seine because of the rainfall, but they got it cleaned up. And I was just there 2 weeks ago, and unfortunately it was closed to swimming because I really wanted to jump into it, but I wasn't able to. But they're doing that. And so this idea of, because I think one of the things that's really come out of this for me is that this crisis, this climate crisis most broadly is, a real inflection point for civilization for all kinds of ways. And I think that one of the jobs of people like me is to help people understand and think about the implications, the scope and scale of the changes that are happening. And I think that, there's going to be a lot of better stuff that's going to come out of this, And every time I drive down the street in Austin and I see, the 17-lane highways and the 15 miles of strip malls, I think, okay, we can do better. It's not like our world is like, oh, don't mess with it. It's like this perfect jewel. We've done a lot of dumb shit. And, this is an opportunity to do smarter stuff in a lot of places and in a lot of ways and make, especially cities, much more human, much more pleasant, less, driven by the tyranny of the automobile and all of that. And so that chapter is really important to me because I think that taking heat, but also climate change more broadly, seriously, and inspiring the kind of political leadership that takes this seriously can really build a better world. I mean, I think it can be amazing. I mean, I think Paris, just being there 2 weeks ago, last time I'd been there was 6 years ago, and it's changed so much. And it's like, wow, this is better. This is way better. And they're just beginning. So it's this sense of opportunity and of, possibility and imagination that I wanted to kind of trigger in that chapter.
Thank you so much. Yeah. So we've got time for questions, and we're going to ask that when you get the mic to ask a question and not to go on a long speaking part.
Sure. I come from India, where we produce roughly 2 tons of carbon dioxide per human being per year. And I'm now being graciously hosted here in the US, which consumes 17 tons which produces 17 tons of carbon dioxide per year. And so my question is about personal responsibility as an inhabitant of this globe. I don't want to be critical, but there was a puritanical streak in me which suddenly emerged in the last 4 weeks in the US, where I saw vacation homes where the heat and the air conditioning is never switched off. Homes which may be used for 2 or 3 weeks in the year. So my question is, what do you think about personal responsibility for overconsumption of energy?
Oh, well, I mean, I think it's huge. And I think that you're exactly right. And, virtually every time I give a talk, someone will stand up and say, well, what about the problem of overpopulation? There's too many people. There's too many people in India. There's too many people in China. And I always point out, no, the problem is not too many people. The problem is the 1% of people, like basically all of us, the people you're talking about, who have these giant houses that are air conditioned to 62 degrees. In Texas, this is a thing. I mean, you go into people's houses and you have to put a sweater on a summer day. And it's like, are you insane? And it's like this show of wealth. Like if you can have your house really, really cold so that your nostril hairs freeze when you walk in, then that's really like a show of wealth and power, right? And so, yes, it's really about consumerism more than it is about anything else, and how we consume and what we consume and what we think of our standards of comfort are. I had a conversation with a very famous architect whose name, if any of you are into architecture, you would know immediately, but I can't say his name because we were talking kind of off the record over drinks, and I don't really want to repeat with his name on it things that he said. But he built some of the most iconic buildings in the world, and also private homes and things, but he's a really rock star architect. And I said, can't you build all these great buildings and do all this great stuff without putting on all this crazy air conditioning and all this stuff? And he said, absolutely, I can do that. I can build fantastic structures with zero air conditioning and have a very comfortable climate and very wonderful living quarters and quality of life in the building. But my clients won't allow it. They are addicted to comfort, basically, is what he said. They're addicted to comfort. And the idea that the temperatures might fluctuate 2 or 3 degrees, they're like, no, forget it. I want the mechanical thing. And so that is a big problem. I mean, but to say it's about personal responsibility is very true, but it's also about personal responsibility in our political choices, right? I mean, it's not just about like, where do you keep your thermostat and what kind of car do you drive? It's also about who are you voting for and who are you out there organizing for, and who are you supporting, and where are you donating your money for campaigns? Because this is a political problem beyond personal responsibility. We need to broaden the scale of choices. You are not going to reimagine downtown Boulder yourself. You need the political apparatus to do this. We need the political apparatus in America to change building codes, to, put in public transportation in places. In Texas, we just keep building bigger and bigger highways, and that's because that's how the politicians see it. And they get a lot of money from the oil companies and the auto companies, and hell with bike lanes. What do you need a bike lane for, right? And so until we get people in office who think differently, it's going to be really hard to make these kinds of changes that we meet. And I mentioned Paris before, and one of the reasons Paris is so successful is the mayor has just been a kick-ass advocate for all this stuff for like a decade, and she has really, almost single-handedly reshaped the city. So yes, personal responsibility, but beyond just where your thermostat is. It's like where your politics are. And this is not a plea for like liberals, because some of the most important environmental legislation in America has been passed by conservatives. Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, those were Republicans who passed that stuff, right? So this is not like some plea for tree huggers. This is a plea for people who are, care about this, whether you're, left or right, it doesn't matter. It's not partisan in that way. Although it is now, of course, with the MAGA people, but that's a whole other story. Right.
I don't know if this is, oh, there you go. Yes, the mayor of Scottsdale, for instance, isn't going to get reelected if they shut off all the spritzers in the restaurants and the outdoor, sidewalk air conditioning when it's 110. That aside, my question is, it feels like in this country, journalistically, we have our head in the sand, and I don't hear a lot. I look forward to reading your book, but I don't hear a lot or read a lot about what we're doing to inform our American public and or put information about the reality of climate change into our school systems. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, the school system thing, I think is obviously separate from the media stuff, but I mean, I think that's really important. And where I live in Texas and in Florida, Florida just passed, Governor DeSantis just signed legislation forbidding the words climate change to be in anything in school. I mean, there's a total war, and this is part of the way that climate and energy has been sucked into this culture war that we have in America. It's like, if you care about, Trump is always ranting about he calls them windmills. Windmills is part of woke culture. It's like, for him, it's the same thing as transgender stuff. It's nothing to do with science or reality, right? It's just part of this woke thing. And so, yes, getting good education into schools about this is really, really, really important. And it's really, really hard because it's political. Again, in Texas, we have this far-right legislature that will not let anything like that. They're banning books right and left. Who was I talking to? I had an email from a librarian. Oh, in San Antonio, I did a talk with the San Antonio Public Library the other day on Zoom, and she told me that my book, the number of people that come into the library and saying that my book should be banned from the library. I was like, but I mean, that's what's happening. So so this is, again, part of the political problem, right? And it's for the media. The media is a whole other thing. I mean, first of all, media is when you say media, it's like saying human. There's lots of different humans, and there's lots of different media, so it's hard to generalize. And I think the media does a very bad job of this sometimes, but I think media is generally doing better too. I think that if you are curious about this, it's out there. I think that, in the 20 years I've been writing about it, it's certainly gotten a lot better. You can turn on TV now and see, good reporting about climate change in a way that you couldn't 15 years ago, 10 years ago. There's a lot more writing about it. There's also a lot more denialism and, kind of pushback from the right on, that's trying to sort of undermine the science at all, right? And this idea that that climate change is some kind of belief system, like, is a very big problem right now. But the media's got all kinds of problems. In all kinds of ways, and it's really hard to generalize about the media.
The next question, local concern. Rocky Flats weapons facility is just 6 miles south of here. If you were to point at the rocks on the poster behind you with your left hand, sir, about 45 degrees off of those rocks is the site where 17,000 plutonium pits were manufactured. My question to you is, from the periodic table, should we be more concerned with gamma or alpha particles? And on a global climate question, which of these two things are more concerning for us?
So I'm going to completely dodge this question because this is not my area of expertise. And if there's one thing I've learned is not to weigh in on things that you're not fully knowledgeable about. So this gets beyond my pay grade. And it's not really a central climate issue. And so it's not really on my radar. I'm aware of the Rocky Flats general issue, but I apologize, but I really just don't have the expertise to answer that question.
This will be our last question. In your experience, do you think there is any hope that we can stop this, or we are above, just surpass any hope because we went too far with the global warming, that there is no more, we cannot really retrieve this problem? And I live in Miami, and in 1970, I used to snorkel, and it was beautiful. And now, if I go snorkel, I start crying.
Yeah. Me too, in Miami.
Yeah,
There's no
Miami.
hope in Miami,
No.
but generally, there is hope. This question of have we reached some kind of tipping point, is it gone too far, is one of the things that frustrates me most in this conversation. Because the simple answer is no, it's not too late. It's not even close to too late. There is no too late. There are various degrees of danger and risk. And every year that we slow the transition away from fossil fuels, that we keep putting CO2 into the atmosphere, that we keep doing all the dumb stuff that we've been doing, is going to make the future hotter, more chaotic, more extreme. But there is no moment when it's like, oh, well, we're all screwed, let's just go to the beach and, play out the last days. That is not what's going to happen. Every solar panel that replaces a coal plant is an improvement in the kind of warming that we're going to see. Every highway that is not built and public transportation is built that reduces emissions is a step in the right direction, right? There's no global tipping point. And furthermore, like what is going to matter for you in Miami is going to be very different than what's going to matter for poor Sebastian Perez, the farm worker who died in Oregon, or for Elon Musk, who's got 87 billion or 487 billion, however much it is, dollars. I mean, there's not, Elon can go live on Mars. He's got the money to do it. So, the sort of too late thing, it's very different for everybody, right? And so as the climate gets hotter and hotter, and as it gets more extreme, it's going to, more and more people will be vulnerable. But there's no tipping point. There's no moment when hope is lost. That's this sort of fallacy that's out there that is the sort of wrong framework for thinking about this. The way for thinking about this is like every action matters, and everything that we do makes a difference. We are on a trajectory. We are living in a different climate. We're not going back to the climate we grew up in. But that does not mean that we're doomed. It means that we better get our act together and think differently about how we live and get engaged in this, right? Not in like writing it off and saying, we're all doomed, and so, I don't need to think about it. It's the opposite. We need to think about it. We need to get educated. You need to make smart choices about where you live, about how you live, about how you vote, all of that kind of stuff.
Well, thank you. We want to thank Jeanine, Canty, and Jeff. God, I'm so sorry.
Goodell.
Jeff. Anyway, thank you. That was a very thoughtful discussion, and I think we all learned quite a bit. Both of the authors will be available downstairs if you wish to carry on a conversation or ask them questions for those of you who couldn't. So they'll be signing their books. So I guess that's probably the next thing to do, is read Jeff's book. So thank you all for coming.
Thank you.